Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am typically joined with my wingman Bob Schlehuber, but he's on vacation today. But that in no way will deter us from doing the news and going against the grain. We have an exceptional show for you today to bookend the weekend. We'll start off with a strange and inspiring realization that occurred to me as I watched the news being released on Donald Trump's plan to retaliate against Twitter and social media companies for perceived bias against conservative voices. In reality, Trump threw a hissy fit because he got fact-checked by Twitter. Now, he's in campaign mode, and this is a persistent complaint from his base. Basically, that right-wing news sources or conservative sources are being silenced by social media companies that are part of the radical left. It's utter nonsense. But as I watched this, and as I read through the analysis by Morning Consult, I had this strange, counterintuitive, euphoric, hopeful realization as I watched. Yes, I was radically inspired. And yes, it was by Donald Trump for the weirdest and most backwards of reasons. Immediately after the monologue, we'll speak with author and editor of Black Agenda Report, Glenn Ford, on the protests occurring in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in repudiation of the viral murder of George Floyd by lunatic officer Derek Chauvin. Chauvin drove his knee into Floyd's throat for 7 minutes long until he ceased to exist. Disturbing, cathartic, jarring, the outcry spurred protests and aggressive action across the United States, including the torching of a Minneapolis, Minnesota police station. We'll also discuss the media and the political response to the Minneapolis PD murder of Floyd and the subsequent protests. We'll also give historical context on the means police departments and intelligence services use to break up these type of gatherings, to undermine, or for that matter, to even smear movements of people. Everything from COINTELPRO to Operation Mockingbird to basic actions from the standpoint of undercover agents as provocateurs to otherwise peaceful activism. They find all sorts of ways to undermine protests. Think back to Occupy Wall Street and the means that the federal government and local governments were doing in order to disrupt and get rid of that movement. We'll keep the momentum going into the second hour with a discussion on Amy Klobuchar's role as state prosecutor in Minnesota and what this could mean for the prosecution of any of the 4 fired cops responsible for Floyd's murder. It should also be noted that Klobuchar refused to press charges against Chauvin, the killer at the center of the case, for a prior killing and shooting. We'll also discuss Biden's policy and reality-free plan to grapple with the disastrous unemployment numbers released yesterday. And by reality-free, I mean there are no policy proposals at all. It's wishful thinking. With China trolling the United States for the protests that have started to sweep across the country, we'll discuss the Cold War, specifically why it wasn't all that cold for the countries that were basically on the front line of the proxy conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, basically 2 superpowers. Last but not least, it is Friday. That means the hardest segment on the network. Come at me, bro. You feel strong, you have something on your chest. This is your day, this is your moment. Your engagement on this segment is amply appreciated, so definitely feel free to chat, tweet, or call. But more than anything else, let's start here. I had the strangest of epiphanies last night. As I read through the Morning Consult analysis of Donald Trump's retaliatory hissy fit executive order against Twitter, the order, true, would broadly speaking affect all of social media, especially if it's a platform where people can put ideas and thoughts. But Twitter was the unique source of the rage of the president, as the platform interfered with the president's ability to lie on a grand and epic scale unencumbered with announcements of reality. Morning Consult is reporting the following on the executive order. President Donald Trump signed an executive order Thursday targeting social media companies' content moderation policies, imploring the Federal Trade Commission to review complaints of political bias on the platforms and the Federal Communications Commission to review how it regulates liability protections afforded by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. The order appears to be a response to Twitter's decision Tuesday to place fact-check labels on two of the president's tweets that included unsupported claims about mail-in voting. On Wednesday, Trump signaled that he would either strongly regulate or shut down social media platforms as a result. Now, the wild part about this is Donald Trump has put out another absolutely unhinged tweet, basically saying that they're going to shoot protesters. Now, Twitter flagged that as being inappropriate and breaking the rules of its platform. So you can imagine that more belligerence from Donald Trump is going to come. Now, this behavior is unhinged. And under normal circumstances, this will have all sorts of waves of hopelessness, of despondency. Oh God, I can't believe this is real. How on earth did my reality get to be in this particular fashion? This is not a rational world. And can't other people see that this is not it would bother me. It would bother me greatly, these kind of existential angst. But that wasn't my response to this. My response was actually somewhat different. If this was a movie script, I trash it as criminally implausible. After all, we're in the middle of a pandemic. There are 100,000 people that are dead. Just that morning, they had the unemployment numbers with 40 million Americans without a job. You're going to have hundreds of thousands of people that get evicted from their house from not being able to pay the rent because they don't have access to the things they need because of the governmental device that should have made sure that people were good and people had their wages and people could buy their food and people could pay their rent. That didn't work. Instead, a president focused entirely on the interests of the 1% and gave trillions of dollars federal treasury while basically giving the people a pittance. People were struggling. $1,200 didn't pay rent in most places. And to put it in perspective, the unemployment benefits didn't go to a large share of the population, meaning the majority wasn't getting the unemployment benefits, despite the fact that the unemployment benefits were supposed to have been made available. 1 in 4 workers in this country is out of a job, complete with food lines going both sides of the country, being California and New York. This wasn't a situation where we didn't know what was coming, by the way. This was something where we knew for months, going all the way back to January, potentially in December, that this was coming. We even had people in the World Health Organization to give us accurate information about what was taking place in China. And even if we didn't, we saw them shut down an entire city. There's no excuse. Don't blame China. Don't blame anybody else. Blame the incompetence of the government and Trump. And yet, in this particular moment, when all of this stuff is going wrong, keep in mind, even before we got to this point, the majority of the public was living paycheck to paycheck. Put that in perspective. Most didn't have $500 in the bank, and a subset of those had nothing in the bank. And you have, on top of that, a distribution or a disproportionate number of some of your population being affected more than others, meaning blacks going 3 to 1 compared to whites as opposed to the people who are dying in this. Percentage-wise. I guess my point is you have tremendous and pressing problems that is going after your nation. And the thing that Donald Trump thought was the most important thing in the world, the thing he needed to talk about, he needed to get off his chest, was the fact that Twitter fact-checked him on basically putting out flagrant lies. Yes, it's too ludicrous to imagine. It doesn't feel all that real. It's a surreal experience to read that, and also to right beside it read that Jeff Bezos is going to be somewhat of a trillionaire, and that $60 billion were basically given to the billionaire class over the time frame, that all of these people have lost their jobs, that all of these people are in dire straits. But the thing that mattered to Trump is Twitter. I watched that and I thought to myself, Donald Trump actually did something similar when he shut the government down, and he was perfectly okay with people not having anything to eat, not being able to pay their bills, basically going to work at the TSA, looking over bags and everything else as essential workers without getting a paycheck for it because the president wanted to build a wall. Do you remember that? He went on for months. He didn't care one iota that those people needed to eat. Those people might have had kids. Those people didn't care. What did he do? He shut the governmental edifice down where he was perfectly okay with those people not having their needs met in order to get his political campaign over the finish line. Pure politics, despite the fact that real people were hurt by it. When you look at that, what comes to your mind? Yes, he's sick. Yes, somewhat bit of sociopath. Yes, massively unempathetic. But it also gives you this notion of what the governmental edifice can do if it was brought to bear with explicit intent. Meaning, yes, Trump is using the governmental system in comically ludicrous and utterly fantastically ridiculous ways. And there are ways where most people would say, probably 10, 20 years ago, there's no way anybody would do that. There's no way the public would accept that. But the reality of it is the public does accept that. In the same way I say Donald Trump's belligerence. Why do I say that? Because at this point, the public and the political space and the media space has basically conformed to Trump, not the other way around. They've told you forever that the president couldn't do that. What did Obama say? Obama, he's the weakest man on the planet. Barack Obama, president of the United States. But what you see in this kind of pedantic, pretentious flare-ups, this is basically an exposed nerve that takes place, that is Donald Trump. You see what that office can do if it's brought to bear. And imagine for the moment, if it's not brought to bear on ludicrous, ridiculous political gamesmanship and just retaliatory actions against industries that Donald Trump doesn't like. Imagine for the moment, you brought it to bear with a populist moral argument, just a righteous indignation at the level of class and at the level of hardship that people have to deal with on a daily basis. Whether that's bringing the crowd with you when you're making this argument that 40 million people have lost their health care, it is an outrage that we don't have health care, and take extravagant actions in the same way that Trump is willing to take extravagant actions. But again, instead of for something that's criminally ridiculous, you're doing it for something that is moral and that is digs in you as a lefty and as a person. And it's just, again, morally correct. What matters to you? There is no point to this existence. None. We choose. It's a game space where we choose. And in us choosing, it is the weirdest thing in the world that we would choose to basically give all sorts of resources and wealth to the top 1%. While us, and many of the people like us, basically go hungry or fight in vulnerable situations. Even in the normal of times, most people live paycheck to paycheck. I'm making the point that these are not normal times. And in these not being normal times, you get to see what the president in that office, even though it is for the most ridiculous and absurd of ends, you still get to see what is potentially possible if a president was in that office and not using that office for small, petty, whimsical ideas in order for political gamesmanship, but actually uses the power and strength of that office and to get your or progressive priorities accomplished, to try to save the planet from the standpoint of a Green New Deal, to ensure that each and every American can get a job, to increase the wages of each American, to make sure that when a person gets old or older, society doesn't throw them away. It accepts and regards what they've given over the course of their life and ensures that that person can live a decent life going forward. That we don't put thousands, tens of thousands of dollars of debt on kids' back, where basically people are fork and knife waiting for these children to try to get an education. Those things are benefits to our society, and as such, we as a grouping should cover those things. Our world can be better. And I think the point that I'm trying to make here is, in the same way that Donald Trump can use that device for the stupidest, most ludicrous, outright absurd reasons, imagine what could be done if it was brought to bear with a moral and righteous indignation. With that, we're going to take our first break. Coming up after the break is author, senior editor of the Black Agenda Report, Glenn Ford. He will be giving us context on the protests that have erupted over the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department. You're listening to Political Misfits, live in DC. We'll be back after this.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am typically here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber, but Bob is on vacation. We are still going to keep going against the grain, though, whether Bob is here or not. So let's, you're going to join me. If you guys dig what we are putting down, definitely like, share, and of course, subscribe to this channel. You can also give us a call at 202-521-1320 to respond to something that we've said, or for that matter, anything else that is on your mind. Keep it PG, keep it PG, always. At the very least on this channel, keep it PG. So the last few days, Minneapolis has been in flames, figuratively and literally. Last night, the 3rd District Police Station was torched in response to the murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin. Floyd, on the ground, wasn't resisting, was handcuffed, was pleading for help, exclaiming, "I can't breathe," as Chauvin drove his knee into Floyd's throat for an excruciating 7 minutes until Floyd ceased to move or speak, falling dead. The video was cathartic and disturbing, to put it mildly, and immediately went viral. Protests erupted at the site of the crime. 4 of the cops pinning Floyd to the ground were immediately fired, with the FBI looking into civil rights violations. Now, to give historical context and to discuss the political and the media reaction to Floyd's murder, we're joined by author and executive editor of the Black Agenda Report, the one and only Glenn Ford. Glenn, welcome to the show. Absolutely. I always enjoy having you on the show. You were my first guest, believe it or not. And that show, for whatever reason, the video didn't process well, the sound was off, and I didn't have the heart to bring you back on. It's so bad. It was a great interview, though. But thank you. I appreciate you coming on. Before we start, is there anything you'd like to say in regards to what is transpiring right now, either in some kind of historical context or any way you wish to discuss it, to set the framing in the way that we're about to talk about this, about what's taking place in Minneapolis and Minnesota, the reaction from the standpoint of, you could say, the public in dealing with this, because it's not just African Americans that are out there. You have somewhat of a multicultural mix of people that are out there at these protests. And the media space, meaning what's the historical context from the standpoint of politics and media and looking at what is taking place right now in Minneapolis, Minnesota?
The historical context, this brings up the fact that the vast majority of urban rebellions have stemmed from incidents just like this, from police violence. And this dates back to 1935. That was what was then called the Harlem Riot. We call it the Harlem Rebellion. Before 1935, race riots were almost entirely the domain of white mobs, with black people being the objects of the violence. But Harlem, 1935, marks the first black race riot, as they called it back in those days, in which black people took the initiative. And that has been historical pattern ever since. But it has been so long since white mobs were committing that kind of violence that people associate urban rebellions with black and brown people. But remember, of course, that the incidents that cite those and provoke that kind of violence almost always comes from police. Not always white police these days,
Very
but from
interesting.
police.
And you're right. We can't even say always from police now because you have just random people in pickup trucks that feel perfectly, I guess, capable or perfectly okay with stopping another citizen in order to interrogate that person or, for this matter, kill. And like even in the Trayvon Martin issue, where the cops tell a guy to go home and he turns around and murders him and then gets off. There is something that bothers me greatly in dealing with this situation where, and I would argue is even the reason for the protests or the root of the protests, is that people who are in the society recognize that there is a difference in value that is placed on one group as opposed to another group. So you can have somebody get murdered, choked to death in the middle of the street with people watching, have somebody put their knee on their throat, shoot a child, and no consequences for that stuff. Whereas it's very clear that, okay, society clearly has a lesser view of you in regards to value. And so much so, we're going to implicitly make it clear just by not having any kind of accountability or not having prosecutions. Is that the root of this protest, or does it go deeper into something else?
Yes, white civilian violence against black folks is not unusual at all and should not be unexpected. And I guess I'm talking about the kind of violence that we saw by white people against a black jogger in Brunswick. Back in slavery time and in post-slavery Southern situations, white civilians were expected. White males felt they had an obligation to white society to take the law into their own hands. And mob violence was not the exception, but in many parts of the Deep South was the periodic norm. And the South was never an isolated place in the country. It's the place that set the tone and the circumstances for race relations in the U.S.
One of the I have a pet peeve about people crying on television. I don't particularly like it, especially men. And CNN brought in a crying Negro to basically weep on air and not saying he knows what to tell his kids and everything else. Let's hear Bakari Sellers. I don't like Bakari Sellers for other reasons, but I definitely didn't like this. Let's hear the clip.
It was hard to listen to that interview. It's just so much pain. You get so tired. We have black children. I have a 15-year-old daughter. I mean, what do I tell her? I'm raising a son. I have no idea what to tell him. It's hard being black in this country when your life is not valued.
From my understanding, he got $1,200 per tear that he wept on the show. I'm not making light of it. It's not so much that the subject matter is not plaguing and deeply frustrating. I think it's more so I don't necessarily see the benefit of crying on television, especially when those tears are not going to get done what you need to get done. This is a political issue and even a culture issue. What's your perspective of this? I mean, am I being too harsh when I look at what Bakari is doing here?
No, you're not being too harsh with regard to Bakari Sellers. Certainly, he could be faking tears. He fakes being a journalist on CNN. So he's quite capable of faking tears.
The funny part is, not the funny part, but one of the disturbing things that I realized as I was watching what was taking place with George, and there was another story that came out about the woman with the leash and the dog. Basically, she was choking the dog and she was threatening the gentleman with the criminal justice system. I mean, she's basically, look, I know who the system works for. It works for me. And so even though I'm in the wrong, even though my dog is not on the leash in the way he's supposed to be on the leash, I am going to threaten you by calling the cops. Now, what is the connection between her feeling perfectly privileged to do that and being perfectly clear of who the cops are going to function for, and basically the cop that had killed people in the past and that was retained on the force that eventually came and shot others and ultimately killing Floyd?
She's perfectly aware. She's an educated, worldly Manhattanite. She knows the purpose of police in this country, or that rather, she knows that she is from the class that is most often protected by the police, and the class that can invoke their authority at any moment with black people. Just as black people at the other side of the spectrum resist the urge to call police, even if a family member, for example, has become threatening and even violent. Resist calling police because that's the worst possible way to answer a situation.
I mean, if you ask any random African American, they would say, yes, I would appreciate the ability to call the cops without thinking I'm going to get shot or arrested in my own home. But it's like, do you want to take that chance? And that becomes a little dicey. And that in and of itself is a cultural problem. I'm curious, my producer, Michelle Whitty, she asked, why do you think Bakari is crying is BS? Meaning, why do you think he's lying about the tears? Why do you think he's faking his tears here?
As I said, I think he's capable of faking any range of emotions at the drop of a hat because he fakes being a journalist on CNN.
I guess what I'm asking is, why do you think tears in this moment is nonsense? Like, say, for example, he was being entirely sincere. I don't buy it, but let's say he was being entirely sincere. I don't know what to tell my kids. That type of stuff. Why is that reaction wrong? Or is that reaction wrong? And maybe wrong, right and wrong is not absolutes. Those things are tethered to some goalposts. But from your standpoint, why is that not productive use of energy, of getting on television, basically crying and weeping, that this guy's doing? Let's say even if he was being legit and even if he was being serious about it.
Well, I see what you mean. Now, of course, it is not inappropriate to cry in the face of a murder, a grave harm done to a fellow human being. But Kari had fared for his appearance on television by responding only with tears rather than an analysis. He certainly avoided having to make some real political choices in terms of a response. Essentially, all he did is show a pain that was being acted out and responded to, meanwhile, in the streets by masses of black folks and others of
I'm
goodwill.
curious, let's jump to Joe Biden for the moment, because Joe Biden came out with a response for all of these people who've lost their jobs. Basically, he put out a statement, no policy or anything else. Now, Joe Biden also got in trouble recently for saying, if you don't know who to vote for between him and Trump, you ain't black. So he's saying that you're not black, Glenn, and then I'm not black. And there's a whole lot of people who apparently are not necessarily black under Joe Biden's mindset. Now, Joe Biden came out after and says, hey, I apologize. He was being a wise guy. He wasn't being a wise guy. He was asking specifically for policy, something that you should do in a political space. And he basically said, look, he was being a wise guy, and I responded to the fact that he was being a wise guy, but I don't take the black community for granted. I worked tirelessly for that community, and he went on with basically a nonsense 5 minutes about how much he loves the black community. How absurd is this? I mean, this is ludicrous, right? Joe Biden has not been this great friend to the African-American community. Can you speak about that? Joe Biden has a 40-year track record.
That's right. And Joe Biden feels free to violate any sense of an alliance with black people whenever he chooses with his anti-black legislation and occasional anti-black overt statements. But he feels safe in that because he knows that the black community feels that it has no choice but to vote for a Democrat. We have a duopoly political system in which one of the parties is always the white man's party, that being the party in which white supremacy is the central organizing principle. There is always a white man's party in the United States. It's now the Republicans. It used to be the Democrats. And Blacks are therefore in this duopoly system forced to deal, if they're going to vote for a major party, to become Democrats. And all the Democrats know it. The black Democrats know it. The white Democrats know it. And of course, you take for granted a captive constituency. And Biden does that.
And by the way, I had no issue with Biden
time.
saying it, because my
now,
thought was, that's true. Like, Hillary Clinton gave nothing, and she got 91% of the black vote. Put that in perspective. Like, that's the opposite of politics. Meaning, for people who wring their hands to say, I don't understand why the Democrats take me for granted. Well, they take you for granted because you're voting to the tune of 91%. Because, again, it's the argument, who keep the monsters at bay? And Democrats can say, you have nowhere else to go. So Joe Biden can get here. I think the issue here is that Joe Biden said the quiet part aloud. That's the only issue here.
Right, and in fact, that is more evidence of Biden's semi-senile condition, that he would utter the truth out loud. Clearly, he lacks discipline. You're not supposed to say that, because if people are forced by others who utter the truth out loud to recognize their condition as captives, many of them will rebel. And then Democrats won't be able to count on
right there,
the black
rebel.
vote as a given.
Now, we have a situation where, because I think, kind of like the Russian Revolution, you made the point before that it usually takes something to happen to motivate behavior. Like, there's always, there's like a potential that needs to be overcome in order to get to people believe that, all right, our situation is so horrible that the energy that it takes to do something is less onerous than actually, less labor burdensome than actually just staying the way it is. And so you have something like a police killing where all of a sudden all of this anger and rage overcomes whatever positive or passive energy that kind of exists in a society. That's tension that's there where people realize it's inequitable, they realize it's not fair, but it's something to snap it off. When we are in a situation where African Americans are dying 3-1 from a virus, from a pandemic, you have people being killed just over the last month or so. I think I can name 3 or 4 people who got killed in these just weird, awful ways, either by cops or by people taking the law into their own hands in the weirdest of cases. And all of these people who've lost their jobs, 40 million people, you have people doing soup kitchens and whatnot, and you have a disproportionate share of those people being people of color. When you calculate all of that stuff, how is there not any disconnect, or why is the disconnect there between, look, if we're putting 91% of support in this party, we have expectations that go beyond just putting a black face as your VP. Why can that circuit never connect?
The difficulty here is caused by the fact that black politics at every level is totally saturated, totally infested by the Democratic Party. That is, and when I say black politics, I'm not just talking about electoral politics. Black fraternities and sororities become annexes of the Democratic Party during election years. All of our civic organizations are basically Democratic outposts. So it's way beyond just black elected officials who are overwhelmingly Democrats. There is a whole political class in a black America, which we at Black Agenda Report call the Black Misleadership class, that is embedded in the Democratic Party and sees its class and the individuals see their personal futures and states tied up totally in the Democratic Party. And so the Democratic Party is position in black America, it acts as a block not only to protest against democratic policies, the practices of democratic presidents and other democratic politicians, but acts as a block on independent black political activity. These are the folks, like in Baltimore, who immediately describe their own constituents as thugs and criminals when they protest vigorously against injustice. We probably are making a big deal about Trump tweeting veiled threats to shoot protesters in the wake of George Floyd's killing. But there are black misleader politicians who are busy right now in cities across the country trying to make sure that there aren't militant responses to what happened to brother
Speaking
George
of that,
Floyd.
what are the? I'm glad you brought that up. The bipartisan or black misleadership class, and it's funny as I thought of the question, two sides of the question kind of came into focus all at once. So, what were the bipartisan steps that these guys went through, Republicans and Democrats, to create the criminal justice system that basically ended up getting Floyd killed in the first place in two ways? In one case, you have a party that is so just marginally different from the Republicans that there's no real expansive policy to deal with the rough edges of our capitalistic system. So things like services or health care or things that ensure that people are made whole, those things don't entirely exist. So people are always at the hard edges of it. And then on the flip side, a criminal justice system that, as opposed to trying to deal with the organic outgrowth of difficulty in your society, we just put in cops. It's like we're just going to put in this kind of blunt force object to deal with a societal issue and a cultural issue that we just haven't given resources to the various aspects of our society to ensure that the people remain whole and competent and safe in our society. But now we're just going to get cops to do it. Could you talk about how both parties have contributed to this in the way that we've structured our criminal justice system, including the way that Floyd ended up getting killed this time around?
Well, there are some differences between the parties. How could there not be when all of the progressive constituencies are crowded into one party, and the other party is, in terms of its voting constituency, on policy. But of the ruling class, which controls both parties, which funds both parties, is to make sure that those differences between the parties are limited and that neither of these two parties do anything that harms the central interests of the rulers. Now, regarding the Democrats and Joe Biden's remarks, the Democrats are always collectively talking like Joe Biden in terms of you have no other choice. They used to, black folks specifically, but everybody else also, threaten voters by saying, if you don't vote for us, Supreme Court, what the Republicans are going to do to the Supreme Court. And that usually worked. President Obama, in his last 2 years in office, had the opportunity to name a justice to the Supreme Court, and he did. And the Republicans didn't move on it. They just sat on the nomination until the clock ran out. What did President Obama do in that interim? Basically, nothing. He could have raised holy hell. He could have made the Republicans pay a heavy political price for sitting on the nomination. He couldn't have forced their hand, but he could have made it a very painful exercise politically for the Republicans. But he didn't. It was an easy thing to do. And the Republicans got to name their own nominee to the Supreme Court. Well, what Obama was showing was that even the Democrats don't believe their threat to black folks about Republicans being about leaving the Supreme Court to the Republicans. Because if they did, then Barack Obama would not have been so tame and timid when the Republicans bullied him on,
That's right. He would have went to
that
the mat.
issue.
I mean, can you imagine what Trump would have done in this case? All right, so we have two callers. So first, we're going to bring in Rod. Rod, what's going on?
Hey, how you doing, guys? Yeah, I just wanted to comment on, you brought up the segment with Bakari Sellers and him crying. That's not the first time he cried. I believe he's done it 2 times before in the last 2 years. And then we had I forget the other gentleman's name. He does the weekend mornings, and and he cried as well. And I just wanted, that's it's very offensive, especially in a sensitive time for people like that, because they're not really. I'm not saying they don't care about the situation, but I feel like they're doing it for points as far as for their employment. Bakari Sellers is a devout Democrat. I mean, he defends the Democrats almost to death, and so he's only crying because of the eyes that's on the TV right now because of the situation that's going on. And I believe that's completely insensitive and disgusting, because he doesn't cry when other crimes that happen in where I believe he's from South Carolina, any other murder of children or any other heinous crimes that happen. It's only when it's politically sensitive to him. So it's very disgusting. Certain people like that in positions of somewhat of influence to use it to use his acting
Very
skills.
Cool. Thank you, Rod. I appreciate it. We have one more caller, David. What's going on, David? David, can you hear me?
Let's come again.
Okay. Oh, there you are.
Yes, I'm here.
What's going on, David?
Yes, Jamal. Thank you for taking my call. I've been wanting to get in touch with you for quite some time. So, I've been listening to you for some time now, and I really want to appreciate the perspective that you bring. It's helped positively guide and strengthen my outlook on the events that we currently face. But the one main thing that you've impressed upon me with respect to voting is to always act in a manner that will more quickly and more likely further the progressive policies in which we support. Given that, where my issue lies with you is your position on Biden. We all know that he's made it abundantly clear that he is against everything we support. And unless he has some sort of seismic come to Jesus moment, there will be no way he can earn my vote. And you've made it clear that is likely your position as well. But what I think you fail to do is to identify the path that will give us the best opportunity to further our progressive policies. And in my opinion, that path is unfortunately 4 more years of orange guy.
I feel you.
Biden winning.
Let me answer that. Let me answer that, because I don't think there's a contradiction in my perspective on it. And then I'll bring in Glenn. David, thank you, man, for calling in. I appreciate it. So here's the thing. There are times in politics where it's not so much that you expect a person to acquiesce. It's more so you do it to shame. So if there's an overt perspective of politics, meaning in the way that we engage and interact with one another, and that perspective basically says, in this kind of schoolboy way, that people have these ideas that they want for their policies, and then people who are politicians go and do those policies. Well, when I make this argument that they say Donald Trump is apocalypse, and I say you're willing to let a man that you call the apocalypse win as opposed to unifying the party by accepting Medicare for all that has 88% approval, that's nearly a unanimous approval. How can you legitimately and credibly make the argument to me that you don't support this if it meant beating Trump? It's not so much that I expect them to acquiesce. I want to show the lunacy of the positioning that they're willing to say, yes, this policy has nearly unanimous support, but we're not going to support this policy. It doesn't make sense in a rational way. It's the reason why I use this to kind of shame them on this. Glenn, did you want to respond to either of the comments?
Sure. First of all, we have to say that politics is not entirely electoral politics. Electoral politics only occurs every 2 to 4 years. But politics also includes what people do in the street. People are carrying out politics in Minneapolis and in cities across the country right now. That's politics. It is the politics of the street that affects the most change in the most efficient manner, and that means the most because the people themselves have affected it. The 60s did not result in a host of progressive politicians being elected. That there was no sea change in the composition of the Congress in the 60s. There was no great FDR type of politician elected president of the United States in the 60s. The 60s was marked by people's power, by tens and hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, by thousands of demonstrations, and by cities being burnt down by folks who weren't going to take it anymore. And that's why the 60s was notable, and that's why politics changed in this country as a result of the people's politics of that era. And if we forget that, and if we believe that the only politics that's of importance is electoral politics, well, then the people only have their say once every 2 to 4 years, and then have to sit around and wait for the next election to roll around. That's why folks who think that way are terrified of 4 more years of Trump, because they have no intention of engaging in the people's response to Trump or any other president who sits in the White House. A people's response is infinitely possible, that has infinite possibilities. A people's response could fill the next 4 years, no matter who's president, with people's demands and people's ultimatums to the government. So one outlook is very bleak. It says that people are powerless except on election day. And the other outlook says, no, we can respond to whatever they throw at us every day.
Man, and what I love about that comment is that basically it understands that the electoral system, by keeping your energies focused entirely within the context of electoral politics, you lose out. I mean, the moment that gets gamed, your ability to do anything, if the only way you consider it is electoral politics, basically is diminished. Like, I love the commentary. With that, we're out of time. Glenn Ford, author and senior editor of the Black Agenda Report. Glenn, where can people find you?
It's easy at blackagendareport.com, and we have a new issue every Wednesday.
Thank you for joining us. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We will be back after this.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Fios TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning and I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day, I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am typically here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. If you guys have digged or are digging what we were putting down, like, share, of course, you can always subscribe. You can also reach out to us. I said that in an odd way, but you can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. If there's something on your mind, whatever you want to talk about, just keep it PG. So we have a really interesting story coming in for one Van Jones. Now, Van Jones on CNN is basically saying that he is gravely disappointed in the white moderate. Now, to bring on our producer, Michelle Whitty, the witty Mrs. Whitty. How's it going, Michelle? Welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm very hot because I don't want to turn my air conditioner on, but otherwise doing fine.
People don't necessarily know if they're not from here, but it's actually nice out today. So, Van Jones, explain what's going on with Van Jones here. You brought this and you said you have to see this clip about the white moderate. So let's hear Van Jones.
It's not the racist white person who's in the Ku Klux Klan that we have to worry about. It's the white liberal Hillary Clinton supporter walking her dog in Central Park who would tell you right now, people like that, oh, I don't see race. Race is no big deal to me. I see us all as the same. I give to charities. But the minute she sees a black man who she does not respect or who she has a slight thought against, she weaponized race like she had been trained by the Aryan Nation. A Klans member could not have been better trained to pick up the police and pick up her phone and tell the police it's a black man, African-American man, come get him. So even the most liberal, well-intentioned white person has a virus in his or her brain that can be activated at an instant. And so what you're seeing now is a curtain falling away.
That's a fascinating clip, Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, like I sent this to you and was like, Van Jones on CNN is pretty much saying, beware the white moderate. And he got a lot right. You know, it's people want to act like the real, like the problems are these sort of outlier freaks who are overtly hateful and like to march around in Klan robes and stuff like that. When, the actual sort of constant violence is that of this, system that is built on racial and economic oppression that we are all involved in all of the time and can barely see because we're so deeply enmeshed in it, And I think Van Jones, in a way, is kind of trying to get at that, but you can't really attack this from any angle except to talk about race and gender because those are sort of the like available outlets, So I don't know. I mean, I think it was pretty close to good analysis from CNN.
I mean, it's making this very basic point that it's kind of like the cop thing, right? The reason that the other cops got fired is because they were basically watching him murder somebody. So it's like, yeah, you might have been doing your job okay, but at the end of the day, are you really doing your job okay if you're just standing there watching somebody murder somebody else? It's the white moderate answer. Not so much that it's the committing murder, it's the standing by while this stuff propagates in our society and being able to use the devices of the society to literally just, take or pull rank in a way. And that's his point. I think his point is apt. I think the issue that I think misses with the Van Jones thing is the one on class. Like there's no class analysis in this at all. For example, Eric Garner. Is Eric Garner selling loose cigarettes if he has money in the bank? I don't think so. It's not lucrative. Is this person supposedly cashing or forging checks if the person has money in the bank? I don't think they do. And so it becomes, okay, so there's this element of race to it, but it's still intrinsically linked to the issue of class. And we can only really discuss one of those if we're talking on somewhere like CNN. Am I saying that right? Or do you think you agree or disagree with that?
I agree, but I think it's the people who are, cherry picking each of these incidents as though they are all outliers. Instead, it's like, these are not outliers. This is the system, And so it's funny, actually, the reaction to this that this clip is getting on CNN. It's people, it is pretty hilarious. It's people saying, well, this is an outrage. We were the ones who voted in Obama. And, other people defending him and saying, no, he would have been right. If he hadn't mentioned Hillary Clinton, then it all would have been fine. And it's like, who allowed, Amy Klobuchar isn't standing around in a Klan robe. Amy Klobuchar is not going to push a black kid in front of a truck or something because she's sort of overtly hateful. But it is all of these supposed do-gooders and well-meaning people involved in the system and perpetuating the system that allow these supposed outlier events to take place. And like, without recognizing that, we can't do anything about it. So there's all these people feeling personally called out and like they have to come to the defense of like their liberal friends and their, the Hillary stands. And it's like, open your eyes.
It's funny. I think this goes back to the reparations argument, right? Where it's like, yeah, you can agree with the policy, but how do you get over the finish line when you are going to have all sorts of people who don't entirely regard that stuff honestly? Or, like, for example, Van Jones's point here is apt. Like, and your point, Amy Klobuchar is not standing in a Klan robe. By the same token, Amy Klobuchar did keep a cop that murdered somebody else out of jail. You know what I mean? Like, she's the epitome of the moderate in this case. In this sense, she's a centrist Democrat. And, Van Jones' point, I think Van Jones you guys make a good point. So what is the other story that's coming up? There's a congressman that basically has been losing his mind because they've exposed him to COVID-19. What's going on with that?
There's chaos in Pennsylvania. Because I guess now coming to work with coronavirus is like the new passive-aggressive way to get back at coworkers you don't like. And the Congress in Pennsylvania, the coworkers you don't like are just the other side of the aisle. So I guess the story is this Republican state lawmaker called Andrew Lewis confirmed on Wednesday that he had tested positive for the virus earlier this month, and he began to self-quarantine. But somehow the only people who were told about it were high-ranking Republicans. And so the Democrats kept coming in and like going to meetings with them and stuff, and nobody was telling the Democrats for at least a week. And now Democrat State Representative Brian Sims is very, very angry and put up a couple of videos on Twitter expressing this rage. So let's hear him freaking out.
This morning, apparently, House Democratic leadership learned that for as much as a week, perhaps longer, that House Republican leadership knew that at least one of their members had tested positive for COVID-19, that other members who'd been exposed to him would eventually go on quarantine, but they didn't go on quarantine until they were done serving alongside us, especially those of us that serve on the state government.
Yeah, so he is not happy about it, and he goes on to rail against, because I guess the Republicans have been coming in, a lot of them are not wearing masks. They're doing this whole, like, we've got to show this virus who's boss and show this virus who we're not scared of it. And doing this work that he's calling out as totally fake. So let's hear him. He calls them out explicitly in this next bit.
During that time period, during the entire COVID-19 crisis, the state government committee has been the place where all of these up bills to pretend that it is safe to go back to work have been going. And every single day of this crisis, the state government committee in Pennsylvania has met so that their members could line up one after one and explain that it was safe to go back to work. It was safe to go back to race car driving or dog grooming or getting your hair cut. Meanwhile, what we're learning is that during that time period, they were testing positive. They were notifying one another and they didn't notify us.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
They've turned this into a political issue.
Yeah,
this is literally a health issue. And they've turned this into basically a political football. How weird is that?
Yeah. It's the new smallpox blanket.
Right. It's just so strange to me. It's like somebody says, okay, I have a cold or I have a flu. And then someone else basically says, yeah, but, you should still go to work because that shows that flu who's a boss. It's like, but won't I get other people infected? Yeah, but you'll be showing that flu who's boss. Like, this makes no sense in real rational terms. Because in rational reality, people who are ill don't want to infect other people in that illness. It doesn't become a political football. How bizarre that they've been able to turn this into basically a political stunt. So yeah, this is utterly bizarre. So with that, we're going to end. I'm going to thank Michelle Whitty for joining us. Thank you, Michelle. She's going to be joining us later in the segment. You guys are listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We'll be back after this. Thanks all.
You're listening Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my disembodied co-host, and so disembodied, he is basically on vacation. But no, he's perfectly well. Everything is good. I don't want people saying, does Bob have COVID? Bob doesn't have COVID. Bob is laying on the beach somewhere. But we have another loaded hour for you guys. Now, if you guys are digging what we're putting down, you're enjoying the content, and you want to help us get this content out to more people, like, share, and of course, definitely subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. Also, if you are definitely digging what we're putting down and you have an opinion about something that we've said, something you agree with, disagree with, somewhere in between, definitely give us a call. Your engagement is amply appreciated. The number is 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So we've been covering the killing of George Floyd by recently fired misanthrope Derek Chauvin and the protests that have organically erupted in response to the disturbing video of Chauvin casually murdering Floyd by pinning his knee into his throat for 7 minutes as Floyd begged and pleaded that he couldn't breathe. Later that morning, roughly 3 a.m., I aired a bombshell story uncovered by our next guest on Klobuchar's role as state prosecutor in Minnesota in protecting killer cops, including Derek Chauvin, the same person who basically casually murdered George Floyd. Between 1999 and 2007, Klobuchar declined to bring charges against more than 24 officers that have killed citizens while on duty. Specifically speaking, Chauvin killed Wayne Reyes in 2006 and would later go on to shoot more civilians while in uniform. You heard that right. You often hear people say, well, cops, go there most of their life without killing anybody. And in real terms, it is safer to be a cop than it is to be a garbage man. Look it up. That's true, by the way. But this gentleman not only killed somebody, but he also went on to shoot additional people while remaining on duty under Klobuchar. And of course, he met a bad end with one George Floyd. That said, that doesn't necessarily mean that Klobuchar wasn't doing anything in her job as state prosecutor. She was absolutely and perfectly willing to use her political position or her position as prosecutor to use dodgy evidence to put an innocent 15-year-old African-American child, Mariam Burrell, in prison for life. Even Fox News went after her for this very particular point, and she had zero to no answers in how she put this child in prison. To discuss the piece in Mint Press, we're joined by author, journalist, media analyst, and member of the Glasgow University Media Group, Alan McLeod. Alan, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Jamal. How are you?
And I want to thank you for that article. I thought that article was extraordinarily well in Mint Press. And I went through it, and I think the thing that made it very clear to me was kind of 2 points. How a prosecutor uses their power, meaning that she was perfectly willing to use basically dodgy evidence to put Burrell in prison for life, a child. By the same token, you made the point very clear in the article that there were dozens of cops that were engaged in killings or shootings that she basically declined to prosecute and turned a blind eye on, especially in this particular case. What was her role? Was this business as usual for basically Minnesota under Klobuchar?
Well, Klobuchar was the state prosecutor for Minnesota between 1999 and 2007. And in that time, she declined to bring charges against dozens of officers who had killed citizens while on duty. She campaigned her whole shtick, even in the presidential races. She was this tough on crime. She wasn't liberal at all. She opposed Medicare for all. She opposed the Green New Deal. She opposed the minimum wage up to $15. She was really trying to present herself as this Midwestern, the Republican conservative Democrat. And that's really how she controlled the state prosecution service when she was the state prosecutor.
She had this tough on crime mentality where she was going to lock up as many people as possible. There's even a case where a man, an immigrant called El Salim, he was convicted of not declaring that he had a second job, which actually put him over the level for food stamps and other welfare benefits. The judge, who, let's be clear, was not some sort of bleeding heart liberal, decided to try him on a misdemeanor charge and gave him 364 days in jail. Klobuchar successfully appealed that and got it up to 2 days more. And that was specifically because if you're sentenced to more than a year in jail, you're probably going to get deported. And El Salim was indeed deported. So let's go to Chauvin. Chauvin is a 19-year veteran of the police force and has had a long, long history of incidents, questionable, even shooting people, violence, etc. In 2005, he was involved in the death of 2 people, maybe perhaps not his fault. But with Wayne Reyes, we had the situation where in October 2006, he and a number of other people shot and killed Wayne Reyes. And to be fair to Klobuchar, while she didn't exactly decline to prosecute him, by the time the case was finally heard, she was already in the Senate, having pushed her "Get Tough on Crime" message. So she didn't actually pull the trigger on that one. But there were dozens of other cases. I mean, she could have prosecuted him in 2005 and didn't. And so Chauvin continued on, completely immune to charges, to shoot other civilians again. He shot somebody in 2008 and has had just a litany of complaints, public and private, against him. And he's still on the force almost until this day. And it was only really when the video of him choking out George Floyd went viral that Minnesota authorities felt they had to step in and fire him. And that's really the reason he was fired. It wasn't because of what he did. It was because of the public reaction, and they thought it would probably be safer to fire him than not do anything. Speaking of that,
based on the record and the precedent set by Klobuchar, basically this kind of deference to the police department as opposed to ensuring a certain level of due diligence to ensure that the population is safe. What do you think the reaction is going to be for this prosecutor? Now, I'm going to play a clip from the current prosecutor, Hennepin County attorney Mike Freeman, who basically is addressing a crowd and is giving him his point of view in regards to this very specific case. So let's hear the Mr. Prosecutor. Let's hear the clip.
I will say this, that video is graphic and horrific and terrible, and no person should do that. But my job in the end is to prove that he violated a criminal statute. And there is other evidence that does not support a criminal charge. We need to wade through all of that evidence to come through with a meaningful determination, and we are doing that to the best of our ability.
Alan, don't believe your lying eyes. Believe our secret evidence that showed that this was not a criminal charge. How ludicrous is that? A man is on his belly, hands behind his back, with another cop with his knee on his head, and 3 other cops basically sitting on him, so it's not like the guy can do anything. And they keep him with that knee on his throat for 7 minutes while he pleads and begs and gasps his last breath, finally dropping dead when his body can no longer tolerate the weight of his knee on his throat. And everybody saw it. And his reaction is, yeah, I mean, that looks bad, but, there may be other evidence here beyond what your eyes can clearly see in this video that would absolve this officer of blame. That's astonishing. Am I missing something here?
No, I don't think so. I think once you get to a certain level in society, your job is to defend the indefensible. And police are well known for constantly lying, both in court and in documents. I mean, the police in question, they called it, what did they call it? An officer-involved incident. That's how they Chauvin and Floyd's, the killing of Floyd, right? There was a short narrative that came out where the police were like, actually, he was being very aggressive. But then CCTV came out and showed that was completely false. And so, frankly, we're in a situation where, often the police would just simply lie and say, the man charged at us with a gun, etc. But because this was filmed, they're not really able to do that. So they did have to at least say that something happened. But I thought what Minneapolis police actually called the event right here, they called it "Man Dies After Medical Incident During Police Interaction." That's how they describe it.
That is a way to describe it.
Sure.
There was a clip that I showed my wife last night, and it was basically a cop that leaned into somebody's car and starts punching with all of his force while he's in the car. It looked like something off Crank, where Jason Statham is in the car doing karate or whatever. He's literally just punching people as hard as he can in the face in the car. And so I asked my wife, I said, now you've seen this video. Now, what would you caption this? Like, if you had to give this a title to give people a succinct idea of what this is, what would you call it? She says, cop punches man in the face multiple times. The video was cops use questionable actions in regards to dealing with a suspect. Questionable or controversial. That's what it said. Cops use controversial process in dealing with the suspect. It's amazing how they sanitize this stuff. Like, as if the public didn't see what they just saw.
I mean, there was once an academic, and we've got this speaker in media studies, we call it propaganda. It's this entire lexicon of language and phrases used. Officer-involved shooting is a classic for when officers kill people, the officer was involved, or, a man died when a bullet entered his heart, etc. So, somebody better arrest that bullet then. Or it's all about sanitizing it. It's about using the passive voice. It's about, cleansing the police of any sort of responsibility. And unfortunately, that's going on nationwide, where the police very often feel that they can act with complete immunity with regards to the law. And frankly, I think they're correct, because very, very few officers actually get charged.
And they're protected. I mean, the Klobuchar thing is a perfect example. I think the wildest part is when this kind of question of what does justice means. And it's like, can it really be justice if about 10 years ago, under a black president, you had a man who was choked to death on the streets of New York, screaming or basically saying, "I can't breathe," by an officer that had multiple abuse charges against that officer, that if anybody would have actually did their job and taken him off the street, Garner may be alive today. And then you have almost 10 years later, situation, person choked, person saying, "I can't breathe," another crowd watching him, the person is videotaped, and the officer has all of these things on his record. And, like Michelle made the point before, we need to get away from this notion that it's a bad apple and look at it as, no, this is just how the behavior is basically incentivized for these guys to act that way all throughout the United States. And they're given a certain degree of impunity with it because there's or few and far between regarding consequences. And that's after being videotaped. It's so out there, so wild. I do want to make a slight pivot. So we've been watching the protests that have been taking place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We've been covering those for the channel. And one of the shocking sights that I saw last night was a police station in America on fire. Now, I am not a fan of looting stores. I get the rage and I get the indignity of what occurred, but robbing, to me, makes a mockery of the murder and obscures where the energy needs to go. Meaning, I am so enraged that this society gets across my lack of value by not holding this particular cop responsible, or for that matter, where this can take place 10 years later, for the most part, almost the exact same symptoms, getting across that nothing has fundamentally changed to stop this from taking place. I get the rage of that, but I don't know how that works with, I am so mad that now I'm going to rob a store. So to me, it's like, be very specific. However, one thing that I did find deeply satisfying was that police station on fire. Because anything else, taking out whether it's productive energy, taking out whether it's going to play well, taking out everything else, just from the standpoint of a person who looks at what took place and is horrified what has taken place and what continues to take place, there is something specific and strong about, and even ironic, about having the police station itself to be ending up in flames. Now, one of the countries, you would think that the United States would agree with this. You would think that Donald Trump would agree with this. But Trump put out a tweet basically threatening to kill protesters. Now, China, who has to deal with Hong Kong, put out a tweet So Hugh Jin, the outspoken head of the communist propaganda outlet in Global Times, mocked Pompeo in a tweet that reads, "Secretary Pompeo, please stand with the angry people of Minneapolis, just like you do with the people of Hong Kong." Alan, he certainly has a point, doesn't he?
Yeah, I'm reminded of, the stuff that happened in Syria where they were all like, Trump, Mr. Obama, my yearns for freedom, etc. The fact of the matter is that if this sort of thing was happening in Venezuela or Iran or another enemy state, we'd be lauding the protesters as pro-democracy activists. And yet, when this is happening in a friendly state or our own state, we're talking about them as looters, rioters. Trump decided to call them thugs as well, which is, as everybody knows, a not very well-coded racial term nowadays. Everybody knows what it means. And so we've got this situation where things are escalating, and Trump is deciding to, instead of listening to the demands or playing a sort of populist card, he's deciding to even consider sending in the National Guard and really upping the level of repression. And that sort of repression is something that, even in a year of protests in Hong Kong, we haven't seen Chinese authorities do. And yet the United States looks for it and reaches for it after, one day of losing.
So we've just gotten news, this is breaking. Minnesota Department of Public Safety Commissioner John Harrington said that he just received information that the officer identified as Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd has been taken into custody. He's been taken into custody. Now, whether anything comes of it or not, at the very least, he's been taken into custody. Alan, any comment?
Well, that's obviously a positive step, but you wonder why he's been taken into custody. Has he been arrested, or is he being protected by the police himself? Because they fear that
it's busy. Oh, I see what you mean, like retribution, meaning you have a huge crowd. That crowd is extremely angry. You've had multiple killings. That energy is basically bent up, and it's like, are we bringing them in order to keep them safe, or are we bringing them in to prosecute? That's a good point.
Yeah. Matter is, he wasn't videotaped doing this. This would have been some sort of footnote on page 8 of the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and a few people who saw it will have been radicalized and really disillusioned by it, but it would not be national news, and there certainly wouldn't be any riots going on. The fact of the matter is that somebody filmed it and it went viral, and that's why this is happening. So this is unusual, not because this sort of thing doesn't happen, but it's unusual because of the reaction.
Okay, so Amy Klobuchar comes out and says police officer Derek Chauvin has been arrested and is in custody for the murder of George Floyd. This is the first step towards justice. Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit more cynical regarding justice. I don't think something that continues to happen over and over and over and over and over again is justice. It's one thing if you prosecute somebody, that's great, but I don't know how you balance those scales if the same thing is going to continuously happen. But let me pivot for a bit. I just wanted to put out the recent news that it just came out. So, Alan, you recently shared an interview with Vincent Blevins. Now, there's an interesting tie here between our, let's say, either Cold War behavior or the behavior that we take when we try to destabilize governments. Say, for example, Libya, where we would pay billions to get certain terrorists in order to undermine the country, then say that these are pro-democracy terrorists, and we were going to help with airstrikes. We did the same thing in Syria. We had the same playbook to some degree in the Ukraine. We even had the same playbook in South America, using many of these organizations like the Endowment for Democracy or something to that effect, to basically take operations that used to be held by the CIA and dump all of this money into these quasi-governmental entities. Well, what does that look like now when we have this kind of conversation where we still see the United States take action like that, especially in Venezuela, where you had this contract of them trying to literally topple the government by having this kind of popular uprising that the United States would immediately call pro-democracy. So when we get into this notion of the Cold War, and people can make the argument that the Cold War wasn't that cold at all for countries that were on the hard edges of that proxy conflict. Now, you recently had an interview with Vincent Blevins about his book, The Jakarta Method, which covers the United States' quiet role in the violent crackdowns against socialist and communist organizations and governments around the world, including quite significantly in Jakarta. There's been some press in the last decade about how truly the massacres or how truly horrific the massacres of leftists was in Indonesia in the 60s, but I don't think that's something that people in the United States entirely and fully understand. We've been taught that we won the Cold War just because our economic system was better, and people wanted freedom and liberty and fancy new appliances, that capitalism flourished and socialism just withered and died naturally. But books like Blevin show that this wasn't really the case, that it was ruthless application of violence around the world to actually ensure that the system could dominate. Now, I can't help but see the parallels of the violence that we're seeing at home, meaning here in the United States, both by police and in response to it, but also police violence that is always an ever-present aberration, not necessarily, that's always presented as an aberration and not necessarily a continued repression. Likewise, the reaction is always seen as an outburst to anger, not necessarily something regarding a battle within a class war. Do you see parallels in the way that we've engaged the world, especially in this kind of Cold War scenarios of either South America and leftist governments in South America, or for that matter, leftist governments in Southeast Asia, and how we repress basically uprisings here in the United States, be it Occupy Wall Street or any of these workers' protests that we've had recently?
Security forces around the world have been trained by the United States to root out subversion, activism, basically anybody who cares about their own country and wants it to become more democratic. So we saw the infamous School of the Americas, now renamed WINISEC, train tens of thousands of Latin American generals and police officers who went down there and cracked heads, disappeared millions of people in genocide and massacres across Latin America over the last 70 years. And the whole point of that was to try to create a fertile ground for what the United States calls democracy, which really means a system of governments where Western corporations can reap maximum profits. And throughout the Cold War, like in Brazil and Argentina, across Central America, these dictatorships which oppressed their people being propped up by the U.S. And they were propped up with oppressive, militarized police who were trained to kill on sight. They were trained to see any sort of protest or threat to their authority as a fundamental and devastating and potentially dangerous threat, and to use force whenever they wanted, really. And so we're really seeing a lot of that sort of model used to oppress Asian, Latin American, African countries being brought back and is now being used internally in somewhere like Minneapolis, where we see increasingly militarized police forces across the country, actually. I mean, why on earth does the police force need an armored personnel carrier? We see police forces with tanks, officers with huge amounts of Kevlar armor, people in completely blacked out kits, special ops, death forces, nobody can see their faces, etc. People are supposed to be protecting and serving us. I mean, is that really what they're doing? I don't know.
Yeah, that looks like pacification, not protecting and serving. That looks like something different, I am curious about something, though. What role does shaping a history have to do with the workable point of view that a society has in regards to perpetuating oppression? Meaning, does the explanation of history and does the explaining and the narrative that are put around history that is taught to a population, what's the mechanism by which that is used to constrain what people believe is possible and the workable point of view of those populations, especially when those populations are being repressed?
That's a great question, Jamal. I mean, I think if people knew what was possible and what has come before in terms of democracy and equality and progressive rights, we'd be having a completely different conversation about the world and about what's possible in the U.S. right now. Well, throughout the 90s, neoliberals and people who represent the 1% in America were desperately trying to tell us that this is the end of history, there is no alternative. Like Francis Fukuyama, Thomas Friedman were saying, the only options are United States, whatever it looks like, or North Korea. When in fact that was never actually the case. And so really getting people to forget their own history, forget their own radical traditions, forget their own democratic traditions of what's possible and what's come before and how that could influence the future, it's really a very important part of shaping, as you said, narratives and discussions about what's going on right now. So, for instance, when Bernie Sanders says, maybe we should have healthcare, minimum wage, it's discussed as this outlandish thing from the land of, Moscow or something. But it's never really said that, actually, these are things that Eisenhower, a Republican, thought were inevitable and self-evident and was actually working toward the Second Bill of Rights. And it's not talked about how, this is basically the same sort of system they have in Canada, which is, just over the border. That sort of thing is very important in shaping and framing what we think is possible, we think is impossible, what we think is right, and what we think is wrong.
I'm so glad you brought up Fukuyama, basically the end of history. I've always been enamored with the arrogance of that concept, right? Like, this is, we've gotten to the point where this is all there is. This is the best that we can get. We might move deck chairs around, but at the end of the day, this is what's going to be in perpetuity forever. Like, that's ludicrous on its face, right? But that is kind of the argument, that this is the only system there is. This is the natural system. This is the way the universe is organized in kind of a cosmic balance. And yeah, there'll be upheavals and so forth, but this is just the way our world is. And that narrative and a constant propaganda of that narrative, or propagation of that narrative, every time you go and buy something to eat, every time you go buy candy, every time you get a hamburger, every time you do anything that engages any level of commerce, you're basically worshiping at that church, whether or not you agree with the tenets. And so it's like there's a built-in propaganda in regards to capitalism that just kind of makes it look like normal because it's a fish in water. It's everywhere. It's ever present. Even the way we regard, like you can pick up a brick and say, this brick costs about 2 cents. In real terms, there's no reality to the cent. The brick is a real thing and a real resource, but even in the way we frame it and process it, we process it in these kind of capitalistic monetary terms of value and worth. I'm fascinated by that because I agree with you. That's what's required to some degree in order to constrain the points of view of the society so you don't have to deal with those points of view. So it's like, I don't want to have this fight about whether or not everybody should have health care. So let's just eliminate that from the point of even having a conversation about it. And if you notice, before Sanders took office, that's how it was. Like, issues of economics, issues of health, that stuff was off the table. And basically, you just have Republicans and Democrats fighting these kind of identity battles. Like, that's intentional. Right, Alan?
Yeah, completely. I mean, the thing about neoliberalism and neoliberals is they're remarkable in the sense that they're the only group of people who insist that they have no ideology at all, right? They're just saying default option. This is this is just what happens when you look at the facts, etc. And that's a really devious way of trying to hide their
Yes, it is, because it makes it look like they're the default. It's dishonest on its face. Exactly. I guess it's my point. I agree with you. I'm sorry. Continue.
I'm going to say there's a quote from a playwright, Bertolt Brecht, who says, I don't know who discovered water first, but I'm willing to bet it wasn't a fish. What he meant was this ideology is just all around us. We can't even see it, We never really think that we're just bombarded with images, thousands a day saying you should buy this, you're not going to be worth anything unless you buy this, this is the way to happiness, etc. When we absolutely know it isn't. Money doesn't buy you happiness. The things that really make a difference in life are things that can't be bought, like, love, friendship, freedom, travel, pets, anything like that, music, anything you want to, put in there. All of those things are non-monetary, and people know it. But corporations can't sell us happiness, but they can try and sell us, any other.
They do commodify happiness. They commodify sex. It's like you'd have a very attractive woman there, scantily clad, barely anything on, and she would be like eating a hamburger. Yeah, it's that type of weird stuff that they do. So with this, Alan, I really do appreciate you coming on the show. With that, we're out of time. Alan McLeod, journalist, author, media analyst, and member of the Glasgow University Media Group. Thank you again for joining us, Alan. And with that, you're listening to the Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in DC. We'll be back after this.
Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Wednesdays make you smarter. Tune in to Political Misfits at 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City for Revelations, our weekly look at world mysteries. And yeah, a lot of UFO stuff.
Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here alone today. Bob Schlehuber has the distinction of being on vacation, so I am happy for him. Hopefully he's safely on the beach somewhere with a mask on. But you guys have heard that sound. This is Come At Me Bro segment. This is your day. This is your moment. This is your time to speak your piece. Keep it PG, but make your points. So we have a few callers, so let's go to the callers first. Killian, what's going on?
How's it going, Jamal? Doing pretty good. I was calling in actually about the riot, so no coming at you. Except about that 43-minute wait, I'm going to come at you on that. But besides that, I just wanted to talk about how Minnesota's a blue state, how the mayor in Minneapolis is Democratic, and it comes back to the same thing with Joe Biden and the rest of the Democrats, is that these people are like keeping up a system that incentivizes policing to act in this outrageous way. Where were the Democrats? Where was Obama when they could have changed the police reform and they could have instituted better education, instituted different culture around policing? And and the culture around policing has just infected basically everybody in this country, where so much deference is given to these police officers, and that's why they believe they have this shield. It's almost like a cultural norm that they believe they are somehow higher than thou, and obviously that's being seen now. All of this rioting could have been avoided if they would have just charged him out, the rip. Because if that was me, you, or any normal citizen, or anybody that doesn't have class power, or anybody that doesn't have power in society, they would have been charged instantly from that video.
Immediately. Now, I agree with you, man. Thank you for the call, Killian. I mean, you're right. I mean, you have a situation where basically a cop on multiple occasions, meaning it's not just once. It's not one time and all of a sudden people, set things on fire. This was something that kept happening over and over and over again. Cop looks into a woman's window and shoots in the window. Another person goes into the wrong house and murders the guy in his own house. You have a no-knock warrant, in which case they burst in, killing the other woman laying in the bed. You can't even be black in your own house safely. I mean, some of this stuff is so jarring. And under Democrats, and make it worse, Democrats were in power helping create the security state. So let's keep that in perspective. Joe Biden with that crime bill, he understood the disparity between blacks and whites in regards to the cocaine and crack. He didn't care. They kept it in that bill, and they built that security system party, both one stone at a time. And one last point. I think what they understand is that basically the system works for some and doesn't work for others. And you have, 70% of the country who are white. I think it's just kind of like the woman who was in the dog park. In her mind, the system works for me. And at the end of the day, these guys are in my back pocket. Missing the point that cops will shoot them too, because the issue boils down to class, even though it's linked to race. We have another caller, Stedman. Stedman, what's going on?
Hey, Jamal, this is Stedman. So, kind of wanted to talk about two things. The first thing, since you just got done talking about it, is the situation in Central Park. And so I think I like your show a lot. I like your perspective. I think you're really personable, and, I like the call-in show and everything. But I think sometimes you have a tendency to downplay how race and class intertwine for black people specifically. So like when you mentioned Eric Garner and the loose cigarettes, and you said, if he was from a different class background, would he be selling class cigarettes? Probably not. And I feel like what is being missed in that statement.
Wait. Before we go further, do you think that's true? Like if Eric Garner had, let's say, $5,000 in the bank, would he sell loose cigarettes? Just that by itself?
Right. It's true. I mean, I 100% agree that's true. But the part that I disagree with your framing is, and I guess it's not a framing, but you tend to minimize how in America your race is your class, at least insofar as it applies to ADOS people or African Americans, because we are considered low class. Like we're the underclass in this country. Our oppression financially subsidized the rest of everyone else here. So like when you look at the girl in Park, I think his name was Christian Cooper, is a graduate from Harvard University. But because she just sees a black man in a park in New York, she assumes that that he's of low class. Why are you bird watching? I mean, I have to admit, even me, I was like, why are you bird watching? Like, what are you doing?
Because to me, I don't think she cared what he was. I don't even think she might have considered him lesser than. But I think what she understood was that basically the criminal justice system is going to work for her, and it's not going to work for him. And she totally understands that by threatening him in this way of, I'm going to call the cops, that's basically a threat on his life, potentially. So I'm far more cynical on that part in regards to her reasoning. Also, I think I disagree with you on this. I don't think I downplay race. I think the issue is I don't know how to fix that. Like if we're having a conversation about how do I stop the cop from murdering either Garner or Floyd, and I can say, well, yes, you could put through more stringent policies. Yes, you can put through this procedure or that procedure. But at the end of the day, to me, if that person had more cash, either through higher wages, either a better job with more agency, either an education that would have allowed him not to have all his debt on his back, if those things are in place, then you at the very least shave off a certain percentage of people that are going to have to interact with those cops for basically class-based reasons. It's not that I discount the race part. I just don't know how to fix the race part. Like, I don't know how to stop a doctor who looks at you as black and giving you less pain medication. How do I stop that? Or how do I stop the cop from looking at me when I'm on the way home as not a threat at all and yet get shot because I know the very next day they're going to say, wow, he had a lot of pot in his system, and outright smearing the person who had nothing to do or doing anything wrong in that process. But I guess my question to you is, how do you fix that? And if you can't fix that, then what do you use in order to try to ameliorate some of the worst edges of your system, if not dealing with the issues of class?
I mean, I guess sort of like I think it's Singapore's model where they require people to live amongst each other of different races. A higher proportion, like two people of the same race can't be neighbors in Singapore, I believe. And I mean, there's got to be some large scale, overreaching social dynamics shifted in order for that type of thing to change, where you can start to see your fellow American citizens as human beings.
Yeah. It's like without othering that person. Yeah, like I agree with you. It's funny. A technological. I'm going to let you. Thank you, man. I appreciate you calling in, Statman. I always appreciate the call. I think a technological solution, if you could basically let people live in the life of somebody else over multiple lifetimes, where their classroom is basically I lived through Native American, or I lived through Black or Hispanic or gay, straight, trans, etc. And that way they can have this non-othering effect. But it's a difficult problem, and I don't necessarily know a solution to it. Michelle Whitty, welcome back, Whitty. What's going on? You have a comment about this topic.
I just wanted to say that I think the caller made a really good point, and especially in that case in Central Park. I mean, it was a case. Of course, I think race and class, gender intersect in a lot of important ways, and I think we spend a lot of time focusing on two and not on the third. But in the case in Central Park, it was really laid bare, right? You have two people who are, really similar in terms of class, right? One of them is an investment banker. The other one is a Yale graduate out birding. This is not like, there didn't seem to be a huge class discrepancy between these two people. And yet, both of those people know who the police work for, So it does strip it bare. And you can say, like, you can have as much money as you want, and you can have as many, live in as nice a neighborhood as you want and all this other stuff. But when it comes down to it, there is a difference. And I don't think it serves us to act as if class exists in a vacuum, or like that's the only problem.
They're totally intertwined. I mean, think of Gates. Do you remember Obama's friend, Louis Gates, where he gets arrested by the cop at his own door? The guy is like a doctor, if I'm not mistaken, like in regards to his field. And he gets arrested, and what does Obama do? He has a beer summit with the cop that arrested the guy. Like, it's that's not a class issue at that point. That's literally where he's looking at him from the standpoint of a racial dynamic. And like I said, it's the situation where I think the most frustrating aspect of it to me is this understanding that there are people who are valued less in your society. And that value of less get across in a myriad of ways. I mean, whether it's killing somebody and then getting off, whether it's random people who can stop and then kill those people and then not get prosecuted after doing so. Like, it gets across a certain really flagrant disregard for public safety of a certain demographic. And I think for me, that's the thing that burns more than anything else. Michelle, thank you. I appreciate it. We have one more caller, DJ, and we're going to bring in Obama comments. Obama made a comment about this particular issue. DJ, what's going on, man? Oh, okay. So, Michelle, you have basically Obama, who is giving his commentary about what is taking place with George Floyd, I'm sorry.
Obama tweeted a statement about an hour ago, just saying, people want life to get back as normal, whatever. It's the normal sort of a lot of eloquent words that don't really say anything. But he ends by saying, it's going to fall on Minnesota officials to ensure that this death is investigated thoroughly. And then he says, but it falls on all of us, regardless of our race or station, including the men and women in law enforcement, blah, 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 work together to create this new normal in which the legacy of bigotry and unequal treatment no longer infects our institutions or our hearts.
It's like, shut up, Obama.
Like,
honestly.
We're trying to say it falls on all of us equally. And like, how, again and again, how are we supposed to work hand in hand with a police force that every single time this happens closes ranks, commits a blatant crime to protect their own, you know what I mean? To protect their own boys in blue. How can you look with a straight face and say, okay, time to all work together again?
Think of what they did to Tamir Rice. Perfect example. A 12-year-old is walking around with, I think, like a BB gun or something. It was a fake gun. And within 2 seconds, the cop has jumped out of his car, murdered that 12-year-old, gets off, and they close ranks on that cop to make sure that cop gets safe, despite the fact that there's a 12-year-old who is perfectly innocent, didn't do anything wrong, that has just lost their life. Like, it's so prevalent. Like, so it's like turning around and saying, yes, we also need the community that was basically, where the guy was killed, to also join in with the cops that murdered them, who in no way is going to, hold them responsible. Like, it's not a situation where those cops intervened in him killing that guy. They stood there. And it happens over and over and over again. I think this gets to your point where it's not a bad apple. It's the entire batch that basically gets infected by that stuff. And until that's called out and accepted as not an aberration, but it's just basic operating procedure in the way that cops engage with the public, especially when there's no accountability in the process. It's atrocious. And I get so sick of him talking about this stuff because it's so saccharine. There's nothing in it. It's just, fluff. It's not like he wasn't president one day. He was president at one point, and this was still happening during the time he was president. So, and DJ is back. DJ, what's going on, man?
Hey, how's it going, Jamar? Just make a few points. If you had a device that I invented, if I gave you a remote control, I made it, and it messed up, And what would you do? What would be your first move? Rectify that issue. Okay. Assuming everything, it had its power, the power ground, and you're just looking at the component. If the component was defective, what would you
I don't
do?
understand the question. I would probably have to either send it back and get it replaced.
Okay, you would send it back. In most cases, you're going to refer to the people who made it, right? You're going to say, hey, this is broke. You understand how this works because you made it. So with that, I'm going to look at a quote from Thomas Jefferson, who said that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It's its natural manure. And a letter that he wrote to, William Smith in 1787, he said that God forbid we go 20 years without a rebellion. He's saying that this is natural, that expansion of power and tyrannical behavior. You have the society has to occasionally show the government, hey, we ultimately have all the power because we have the numbers.
Yes, I agree with that. That's vigilance. I mean, because think of it for the moment. You've enshrined an organization with all sorts of powers. And those powers, from the standpoint of to kill, to police, to send people off to war. And having those powers, what do those people tend to do? They tend to accrue more power. And so at some point, the public, especially if the public loses tether with the governmental spot, because I would make the argument we have. Like, look at just a very basic subset. People want taxes increases on the rich. Joe Biden will cut taxes on the rich. People want, majority health care, Medicare for all, 88%. Joe Biden is against it. Democratic Party is against it. Like, there's this weird disconnect between what the public wants versus what the public gets. Well, we've just lost all tether. So I understand where you're coming from with this, where the country at some point needs to assert its dominance over the governmental system, where the government is not running roughshod over the population, but this is not a Frankenstein monster. It is actually under control and is doing what is in the interest of the population. But that's not magic though. That requires a population to be basically, intentional action regarding the use of a governmental system. So I agree with you. I think that's where you're going, right?
I am. And one thing is, I really appreciate how you take the conversation away from race. Yes, race is involved, but we need to stop making, like what happened in Michigan when it's white supremacists. No. Those people are exercising their constitutional rights. When it was done with the Black Panthers, it was, they changed the laws. Well, you know what? In other places, exercise those constitutional rights. If you do not use them, they will atrophy like anything else. Exercise your rights. I appreciate them. I don't care if they are white supremacists. The Constitution is what makes me just like them, and they're exercising those rights, which empowers my rights. I like that. Get a gun, exercise your rights, and this is natural. We need to look at the Founding Fathers. They say if you do not occasionally flex your authority and flex those constitutional rights, we have exercise the Second Amendment responsibly.
Thank you, man. I appreciate the call. All right, so with that, we're going to take a quick break. You guys are listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We'll be back in a moment. DJ, agree with you.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. We've come to our last roughly 10 minutes on the show. We do have a caller, Baltimore Charles. Baltimore, what's going on? Can you hear me?
No.
Okay, fair enough. Well, all right, so let's go into our stories for Section 8. We have, again, the awesome producer Michelle Whitty to join us. Michelle, so what's on the agenda for today? We have multiple stories. Where are we going to go first?
You have a selection of stories. Would you like to hear about Assange in court, a struggling New York Times obituary, or an Australian sex fantasy gone wrong?
You caught me with the middle one. What was the middle one? A tortured obituary from... Let's hit a tortured obituary.
Boring, the sex fantasy gone wrong. I thought you would go right for that one.
All right, so what happened? What's the story? Yeah, I want that one.
You want that? You gotta make a choice. All right. So the BBC, God bless them, brings us this wonderful tale of the sex fantasy that didn't quite work out, that involved a break-in to the wrong house, the arrival of the cops, 2 fully armed men, and yet no death. What an incredible country, right? Where the police don't just immediately slaughter everyone on the scene as soon as they arrive. So apparently, this guy in the state of New South Wales had a kinky fantasy he wanted to play out involving men breaking into his house and tying him up. And, more power to you, buddy. Go for it. So he hired these 2 obliging gentlemen to perform that fantasy for him. But unfortunately, he gave them the wrong address. Or he gave them his address, but then he moved and didn't tell them. So, I guess, wait a couple weeks, they form this sex fantasy. They break into this guy's house, break into this bedroom, and this poor man is lying in bed, wakes up to see 2 men standing over him with machetes. So the 2 men call the name of their client, who's supposed to be the person who they're quote unquote roughing up. And they realize that they've made a mistake, and so hey, sorry, mate.
That's not good. That's so funny. It's funny. I have mixed feelings about this. Part of me think, right on, dude. Do your thing, man. There's no shame in that. You have the capabilities and you have the freedom. Where he's not repressed in a way where he's like, oh, I feel dicey about it. He's like, no, screw that. I'm on this reality frame. I'm gonna have some fun. So God bless. But you got to get the house right. You can't get the wrong address or something like that.
No. Luckily, the 2 guys who were going to help that man fulfill his fantasy have been acquitted of any crime, and everyone realized it was just a terrible mistake.
That's so funny. So let's hear the tortured obituary. We have a few minutes left, so let's hear the obituary one.
Let's hear a moment for the New York Times, which had a really hard time with its obituary of author, playwright, and activist Larry Kramer earlier this week. Kramer was one of the first people to recognize and mobilize on the AIDS crisis in the U.S. in the 80s, founding first the Gay Men's Health Crisis and then ACT UP, which organized street demonstrations demanding funding, research, and a serious response to the new virus, which then was killing gay men in particular by the thousands. And to think that, an obituary about this guy who was such a powerful fighter for funding and research into a health crisis would be something that they could really get into and draw parallels with or whatever. But the New York Times just fell all over itself because they couldn't help but calling him a loud, difficult queen. So the original obituary began that Kramer worked hard to shock the country into dealing with AIDS as a public health crisis, but his often abusive approach could overshadow his achievement. And they shared it, and there was, of course, online outcry at the New York Times calling him abusive. So then the Times changed it to aggressive. And then I guess the editor looked at it and was like, nah, that doesn't really work either. So then they changed it to confrontational, and then they just reworked the whole thing and changed it into, he worked hard to shock the country into AIDS as a public health crisis and foresaw that it could kill millions regardless of sexual orientation. And it just reminded me, a week ago, people were remembering the same paper's obituary of Malcolm X, where in the first paragraph it said he was a case history as well as an extraordinary and twisted man, turning many true gifts to evil purpose.
They said that about Malcolm X. That's brutal. That is horrendous. And so, it's one of those things where opinions that are untethered to anything. Like if I'm just saying I feel this way about that, somebody can say, oh, I love capitalism, I think it's the greatest system. Well, I can't really argue with that. The person may have a death wish And it's his right to have a death wish. There's nothing stopping him from having one point of view or the other. It's only when you start comparing it to real reality. If I say, this wall is made of jello, well, you can observe that in objective reality to make that determination about whether that's true or not, if it'll be true or false. And looking at Malcolm X and giving a criticism like that, it gives you this notion of who that person is, to come away with this notion that Malcolm X was somehow twisted. He was very clear in what he wanted to do. And it's kind of like us watching Israel, right? Israel and Palestine, where you have a situation where, regardless of what Israel does, they can kill thousands of people with 80% civilians. They can put people in prison. They can put kids in prison. They can torture. They can abuse. They can use the equipment and training techniques on Palestinians in order to sell weapons and stuff abroad. And nobody ever looks at that and say, well, the Palestinians have a right to be angry. If this was a situation where the Nazis had taken over France, everybody would have think the Parisians have every right philosophically in the world towards righteous violence and pushing back people who are basically trying to kill, oppress, or injure them. The same thing is true for Palestinians, but we don't regard it that way. And for the longest time, the same thing is true for African Americans. You would have these blow-ups in regards to the way people deal with this stuff. Or, in this case, the gentleman for the gay rights issue. It's like you can't disassociate. You can't disassociate how that person needed to come across during that time frame with the pressure that's being put against them. Michelle, please continue.
I think also what it really made me or showed me is how still we should remember how very, very badly these institutions and these media organs that serve them want us to be quiet. They want us to be quiet in a protest. They want us to write letters to the editor. And I feel like we should remind ourselves of what purpose that is. It's not just because they love civility and politeness and whatever else. It goes to, I think, what works and what doesn't work. I don't think that we have achieved very many things by letter writing.
This is the Glenn Ford argument. Basically, if you could strain your politics to just basically this kind of thin window of a politics thing, then you're almost constrained. Same thing with the writing to the editor thing, right?
Yes, yeah. And another person, we can squeeze in this last story really quick, because this is another person who obviously a lot of people want to quiet, is Julian Assange. And if our listeners want to take a look at exclusive pictures of what Assange's glass cage in his courtroom actually looks like, you can head over to Gray Zone. Our friends over there last night published these pictures of Assange during his trial, where you can see how they have got him like he's wearing a suicide vest or something, trapped behind this wall of glass that effectively prevents him from taking part in his trial at all. He says he can't hear anything. He can't, interject in what's going on. He can't consult with his lawyers. And so you think of all the TV trials that you watch where the accused is sitting next to his or her counselors, and they get to stop the proceedings and confer, and they get to take notes. Assange can't do any of that. He's stuck in this bizarre cage, so that he just gets to sort of vaguely witness his trial, but not do anything to help with his own defense. And I think it's really obvious what they are trying to do here. And the organization that shared these photos, Anonymous Scandinavia, explicitly said they want to highlight what they consider to be the state repression of an independent journalist.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, that really is. I mean, because it's almost like they're trying to draw a red mark around him in order to, it's a shaming aspect to it also by putting him in the cage like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's ridiculous. This person has never been, he's not on trial for any kind of violent crime. He's never been convicted of a violent crime. There's no reason to have him locked behind that wall to ensure that he gets the worst trial possible.
Well, thank you to our guest, Michelle Whitty, for coming on to the show, of course. All good points. I want to thank everybody for their engagement on this show. Your likes, your sharing this videos, all of those things really help this channel out tremendously in getting this particular content out. I want to thank our guests, Glenn Ford and Alan McLeod. Thank you to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, Sol, and the entire Sputnik News team. Thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing. Have a good one, guys. Guys, thank you all for joining us on this show. Running it with Michelle and I basically holding it down for the day, but I think it went extremely well. So thank you. We also had an amazing crowd. I mean, we had like 300 and some people here. Whoa! We have a lot of commentary. So let's go through the chats now. So none of your business, just to support the journalism. Thank you, none of your business. In Willis, did you notice in the footage of the riots last night that 30% of the people out there were not black? Yes, that's what I said. I think it's important for the narrative, solidarity forever. Yes, I said that. Like it wasn't just African Americans. You had people, multicultural, that were outraged by what happened. And I love that intersectionality. I saw that and I thought, that's good. I don't want a situation where people are functioning entirely on their own. I do want that solidarity, where if you are somebody who's gay or trans and there's been an assault, that African Americans stand side by side with you, or if you're a woman and been assaulted, etc. Meaning, we function under the guise of class while also being attentive to the identity issues of the people in the group. Understanding that these things are somehow intrinsically linked to one another and you can't necessarily disassociate them. You have a class structure that basically takes advantage of poor and marginalized communities in order to basically maximize their profit. I mean, we were watching Jeffrey Epstein last night. And one of the interesting things in the Epstein thing, it became clear that he would use his wealth in order to basically pay people in cheap and poorer communities to basically take advantage. So think of somebody who is almost like $1 billion and then say, okay, I'm going to give you $200 to get a massage. And then if you have any friends, I'm going to give them money in order to take advantage. And you ask the secondary question, well, wait a minute. He's basically taking advantage of the poverty of those people in order to get his own sexual desires up. But isn't that the same thing true for capitalism in general? I mean, basically you have somebody who's working at McDonald's, not because they love to work at McDonald's, but because they need the paycheck. And you can look at all sorts of jobs that are like that, where not much agency is a part of the process. The people aren't paid all that well. And basically you can expropriate wealth to the top because people are in situations of dire straits. Well, that's why you need a government and a legislation and people in power that have a very specific ideological focus on issues of class and not this neoliberal nonsense where you have to push these guys on stuff where you shouldn't have to push them at all. It's our choice. And we need to get to the point of not being willing to go with this, you have nowhere else to go, not being willing to acquiesce to not having standards or accountability in our political process. If you want to know why Democrats are so weak and feckless, why they don't do anything about these legislative things or these people getting shot or taking the black vote for granted, it's because there's no accountability. It's not just blacks, poor, lefties, all of these groups fall in line with the Democratic Party despite the fact that they don't offer you squat. And then you're going to be shocked to shit that they take you for granted. They're taking you for granted because you allow them to. Giving that much support without getting anything in return incentivizes you being taken for granted. At some point, there should be some standard, some aspect of you that is not entirely relative to whatever the Republican Party is. And be willing to let them fail on various elements if they're not willing to back your interests. 88% support for Medicare for all in the Democratic Party still tells you to kick rocks and have an expectation of you backing them. If indeed Donald Trump is the apocalypse, if Donald Trump is going to end the world and destroy democracy, how does the Democratic Party, either Pelosi or, for that matter, congressional Democrats or Biden himself, justify not backing a policy that has 88% Democratic support? And for that matter, how does Sanders and AOC and Jayapal, how does all of these other people who supposedly push for these policies immediately acquiesce to voting for Joe Biden as opposed to making that very basic argument that if he really is the apocalypse, how do you justify not backing these policies to beat the guy that you say is going to destroy democracy and end the world? That seems to be a question for the Democratic Party and Biden, not a question for lefties. You get those votes when you represent their interests. And it shouldn't be anything before that. Let's see the next one. Judas Priest. If you heard if you heard that in DC about 10 taxis a day get a crash because the drivers aren't very good, would you trust taxi service? So why would you trust minimum PD? The Minnesota Police Department. Just a few bad apples. Yeah, I don't believe it's a few bad apples. I haven't believed the few bad apples thing in decades. Because, think back to when Eric Holder did that investigation after those people got shot under Obama. I think it was Gray and it was one in Ohio. And when he got shot and when those people got shot, Holder went out and did this kind of appraisal of both areas. And what he basically found was that it was the same in both places, despite being in two different states. That the way they were trained, the perspective that cops had, the policing over one community as opposed to another community, the emphasis that they would put on groups that are poor because those groups can't necessarily fight back legislatively, where richer communities do have the resources to push back against the cops' interests. You had other cases where cops were basically milking that public out of fines and everything else in order to pay to keep the county going. I mean, there's all sorts of disgusting policies that these guys use to screw over and fuck over the poor while allowing people with means to basically escape. If those people got caught in a riot, black, white, anything in between, let's say they took something $200. But our treasury has just dumped trillions into basically banks and companies that are going to fire workers in some cases. Thanks for the money, but yeah, we're going to get rid of those workers. Or protect employee benefits or executive payouts and bonuses and stock buybacks, all of these things. These were giveaways. The same thing happened in 2008 when the economy hit the skids, and what did Bush do? We're going to give that money to the banks, or we're going to give that money to Wall Street. We're going to let these guys walk, and we're going to let the homeowners go bust. That was under Obama. I guess I'm making a very basic point that our system is not geared towards rational action regarding the public. It's geared towards what is in the interest of that owner class. And whether it's Democrats or Republicans, they function and orient around that, regardless of what they say. The catch becomes for the public itself to say, what are we going to do in order to deal with this situation in somewhat of an equitable way where we're not continually at this disadvantage? We have, let's see, there's one more, Wesley Walker. And Wesley, I can't see yours, Wesley, but I'm going to have to end this because my producer's calling. But Wesley, I'll hit you on the next one. Like, share, and subscribe.